August 6th, 1945, 08:15 hours. Radio Tokyo Broadcasting Studio, 6th floor, Yurakucho District. The fragmentary transmission crackled through the decoding machine at 08:47 hours, 13 words that would unravel everything Iva Toguri believed about this war, about survival, about the illusion that holding a microphone in enemy territory had somehow kept her safe. Entire city destroyed by single bomb, unknown weapon, casualties catastrophic, request immediate. The sentence ended mid-word. No static, no fade. Just silence where Hiroshima headquarters had been transmitting 37 seconds earlier. Iva's fingers froze on her script pages, American swing music requests penciled in her UCLA-educated handwriting, jokes about boneheads that she'd softened into comedy to survive the censors. The humid August air pressed against the studio's shattered windows, carrying the stench of Tokyo's firebomb districts 3 miles east. Her headphones felt suddenly heavier than they'd been during 3 years of broadcast that American soldiers across the Pacific had mythologized into something she'd never intended to become. The woman they called Tokyo Rose, a name she'd never spoken, a legend she'd never claimed, watched Japanese military engineers crowd around the telegram like surgeons examining a patient they couldn't save. Their faces betrayed something she'd never witnessed in 1,247 days of enemy occupation. Pure, unfiltered terror. Senior engineer Takeshi Yamamoto dropped his cigarette onto the concrete floor at 08:51 hours. The ember died against the sandbags that lined Radio Tokyo's corridors. Crude fortifications against B-29 raids that had reduced entire Tokyo neighborhoods to ash fields where children now scavenged for rats. 3 aircraft, Yamamoto whispered, his voice cracking on the second word. 3 B-29s over Hiroshima at 08:15 hours. Not 300, not 30, 3. Iva felt her throat constrict. She'd watched American bomber formations before, geometric patterns filling the sky like migrating birds, 300 aircraft strong, dropping incendiaries that turned night into artificial day. 3 planes couldn't carry enough conventional explosives to destroy a city block, let alone Hiroshima's 27 square miles spreading across the Ota River Delta. The second telegram arrived at 09:04 hours, transmitted from a reconnaissance pilot who'd been 40 miles south when the flash occurred. Mushroom-shaped cloud rising 40,000 feet, purple and orange luminescence, firestorm visible from Kure Naval Base. City center no longer visible. Repeat, city center no longer exists. An older officer, Major Hidaki Sato, veteran of Manchuria, survivor of Guadalcanal, sat down heavily on a wooden bench. His hands trembled as he lit a cigarette, the match flame wavering in air that suddenly felt colder despite the August heat. "This changes everything," he said to no one in particular. Iva understood what he meant. For 3 years, every propaganda broadcast, every military briefing, every whispered conversation in Radio Tokyo's bomb-damaged corridors had been built on a single assumption. Japan's warrior spirit would outlast American industrial capacity. Distance and determination would force a negotiated peace. The Americans would grow tired, demoralized, desperate to abandon the Pacific and return home. But if America possessed weapons that could erase cities with 3 aircraft, then every calculation about this war had been catastrophically wrong. Iva Toguri had been born on July 4, 1916, Independence Day, in Los Angeles, California. The irony would become her life's defining curse. She'd sold Girl Scout cookies door to door in her neighborhood, mastering the cheerful American salesmanship that would later save her life behind enemy microphones. She'd sung Methodist hymns every Sunday in a church choir where her voice, raspy, masculine, unmistakably Californian, had been deemed distinctive. She'd studied zoology at UCLA, dissecting frogs and memorizing Latin taxonomies, dreaming of medical school. By every measure that mattered, she was American. She spoke fluent English and barely knew 50 words of Japanese. She dated white boys and ate hamburgers and listened to Duke Ellington on her father's radio. Then July 1941 arrived with a request that seemed harmless. Visit a sick aunt in Japan, just for a few months, a family obligation combined with a graduation gift. She'd booked passage on the SS Arafuru Maru, packed a single suitcase expecting a brief trip, and promised her parents that she'd be home by Christmas. December 7, 1941 destroyed that promise along with 18 American battleships at Pearl Harbor. Overnight, every civilian vessel crossing the Pacific became a military target. The cost of emergency evacuation, $425 per passenger, might as well have been $425,000 for a recent graduate with $37 in her purse. Iva was stranded 6,000 miles from home, an American citizen trapped in a nation now committed to destroying everything she knew. The Kempekai, Japanese military police, came for her in February 1942. 3 officers in crisp uniforms, carrying forms that would determine whether she lived or starved. "Renounce your American citizenship," the lead officer said in halting English. "Sign the papers. Declare loyalty to the emperor. It will make everything easier." Iva looked at the document, renunciation of U.S. citizenship. A single signature that would grant her ration cards, legal employment, protection under Japanese law. 3 words escaped her lips before she could stop them. "I am American." The officer's expression hardened. He stamped her identification papers with red ink. Tekikoku Gaijin, enemy alien. No ration card, no legal employment, no protection. Within 6 months, she was dying. By August 1942, Iva weighed 89 pounds, down from her normal 112. Scurvy ravaged her gums until her teeth loosened in their sockets. Beriberi swelled her legs with fluid retention, turning her calves into grotesque balloons that made walking agony. She spent 6 weeks hospitalized in September 1943 at St. Luke's International Hospital in Tokyo's Tsujiki district. The diagnosis was clinical malnutrition compounded with vitamin deficiency so severe it threatened organ failure. The treatment was minimal: boiled rice and black tea, administered by nurses who whispered their sympathy but could offer nothing more. When she was released in October, skeletal and exhausted, she understood the mathematics of survival. Without ration cards, she had perhaps 4 months before her body cannibalized itself into organ failure. That's when Radio Tokyo found her, or more precisely, when Major Charles Cozens found her. Cozens was Australian, a prisoner of war who'd been an advertising executive and radio announcer before the Japanese captured him in Singapore. The Kempetai had threatened his wife and children unless he produced English-language propaganda broadcasts. But Cozens was quietly brilliant. He'd spent 2 years creating shows that sounded like propaganda, but subtly undermined every message through sarcasm, obvious lies, and comedy so absurd it became parody. He needed someone he could trust, someone authentically American, someone whose voice was too rough, too masculine, too obviously sarcastic to fulfill Japan's fantasy of a sultry seductress whispering poison into GI ears. He chose Iva. "Your voice is terrible," he told her during their first meeting in Radio Tokyo's cramped offices that smelled of cigarette smoke and desperation. "Too raspy, too American, too honest. It's perfect." She became Orphan Anne, a joke about being stranded far from home. Her broadcasts mixed American swing music with comedy that Japanese censors couldn't comprehend because they didn't understand American sarcasm. She called servicemen boneheads and knuckleheads with a laugh that made it impossible to take seriously. But every broadcast was a tightrope she couldn't escape. Too boring, and Japanese officials would replace her with someone who genuinely believed the propaganda. Too entertaining, and American soldiers might think she was actually trying to demoralize them. She walked that line for 1,247 days, never knowing which side would catch her when she fell. Then August 6, 1945 arrived, and the line disappeared entirely. At 09:20 hours, a railway official stumbled into Radio Tokyo's receiving area, his face ash-white, his hands shaking so violently he could barely light a cigarette. He'd been 15 miles southwest of Hiroshima when the flash occurred. "Brighter than 1,000 suns," he whispered to the assembled staff. "I was facing away, and the light burned through my closed eyelids. When I turned around, the entire city center had vanished. Just a pillar of fire rising into the sky, surrounded by a shockwave that flattened trees 5 miles from the epicenter." Iva felt something cold settle into her stomach. Not fear exactly, but recognition. America hadn't been losing this war. America had been holding back. Throughout the afternoon, reports filtered through military channels, each more catastrophic than the last. A single bomb, not 300, not 30, one, had generated temperatures exceeding 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit at ground zero. The thermal radiation had vaporized human beings within a half-mile radius, leaving only shadows burned into concrete where bodies had briefly existed. The blast wave had traveled at 784 miles per hour, faster than sound itself, demolishing every building within 1.5 miles. The firestorm that followed had consumed oxygen so rapidly that survivors reported seeing people running toward the epicenter because the vacuum effect made that direction feel less hot. Casualty estimates climbed throughout the day: 70,000 dead, 80,000, 100,000. The numbers became meaningless, abstractions that couldn't capture what it meant for 350,000 people to experience annihilation delivered by 3 aircraft. At 1100 hours, Iva's supervisor called an emergency staff meeting. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the terror he couldn't vocalize. "Business as usual," he ordered. "Stay on air. Pretend nothing happened. We cannot let American forces know this weapon has affected our resolve." But resolve had become irrelevant. If America could erase cities with single bombs, then Japanese warrior spirit was as obsolete as samurai swords against machine guns. Iva returned to her broadcast booth at 14:30 hours, staring at her script. The usual propaganda about American forces faltering, Japanese resistance growing stronger, victory inevitable. She couldn't read it. The words had been rendered meaningless by a weapon that made propaganda itself obsolete. An engineer knocked on the glass. 2 minutes to air. She placed her hand on her stomach, where the earliest signs of pregnancy had begun manifesting. Morning nausea she had attributed to bad food, but which now felt like a different kind of countdown. A child who would be born into what kind of world? The microphone light turned red at 14:45 hours. She took a breath and began speaking, her voice steady despite the terror rising in her chest. She played Duke Ellington's "Take the A Train." She cracked jokes about boneheads missing home. She pretended nothing had changed. But everything had changed. August 9th, 1945, 11:02 hours, Nagasaki. The second transmission arrived with brutal efficiency. Second atomic weapon deployed. Nagasaki primary target destroyed. Casualty estimates 40,000 to 75,000. Weapon yield greater than Hiroshima device. This time there was no pretending. Radio Tokyo staff members abandoned their posts. Engineers wept openly. Someone tore a propaganda poster off the wall and threw it through a broken window, watching it flutter 3 stories down to Tokyo's devastated streets. 2 cities, 2 bombs, 3 days. Inside the underground chambers of the Imperial Palace, Japan's Supreme War Council fractured into opposing factions. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the architect of kamikaze tactics, argued for continued resistance with the fanaticism of a man who'd already sacrificed thousands of pilots to suicide attacks. We will never be defeated if we are prepared to sacrifice 20 million Japanese lives in homeland defense, he declared during the August 13th emergency session, his voice rising with desperate fervor. The Americans lack the stomach for an invasion that costs them millions of casualties. They will negotiate. But War Minister Korichika Anami, pragmatic despite his militarist credentials, understood the new mathematics. What do 20 million lives matter against a weapon that can erase cities in seconds? If they possess 10 such bombs, they can destroy every major city in Japan within a month. There will be nothing left to defend. Emperor Hirohito made his decision on August 14th, overriding the deadlocked council. His voice would be broadcast the following morning, the first time most Japanese citizens had ever heard their divine emperor speak. If you made it this far, you're the reason channels like ours can keep the past alive. Let me know where you're tuning in from. Drop a like and subscribe so these voices from history continue to be heard. August 15th, 1945, 1200 hours, Radio Tokyo broadcasting the Emperor's surrender address. Iva, now married to Felipe de Aquino, a Portuguese-Japanese man she'd met during occupation, placed her hand on her stomach. 2 months pregnant. The child she'd imagined raising in peacetime, in freedom, in the California sunshine she remembered from before everything collapsed. She allowed herself to imagine it, walking off a ship in San Francisco, breathing ocean air, seeing her parents again, explaining everything. The starvation, the broadcasts, the quiet resistance nobody had witnessed. They would understand, wouldn't they? But as Allied occupation forces began arriving in Tokyo throughout late August, a different reality crystallized around her like ice forming on glass. American soldiers walked through Radio Tokyo's bombed-out corridors on August 28th, examining equipment, interviewing staff. Their expressions hardened when they learned English-language broadcasts had originated there. They asked direct questions. Who was Tokyo Rose? Japanese employees looked at each other nervously. Some pointed toward Iva's empty broadcast booth. Others mentioned Orphan Anne. The American soldiers' faces settled into something cold and final. "Get her name," a lieutenant said to his interpreter. "Get everything." September 1945. 2 American journalists, Harry Brundage and Clark Lee, arrived at Iva's door with an offer that seemed like salvation wrapped in dollar bills. "We want an exclusive interview with the real Tokyo Rose," Brundage said, his smile practiced and professional. $2,000. Just tell your story. The truth, that's all we want. $2,000 was a fortune in occupation-era Tokyo. Iva needed money desperately. Her husband had no legal employment. She was pregnant. The economy was collapsing into hyperinflation, where cigarettes had more value than currency. "I never called myself Tokyo Rose," she said carefully. "That name, I don't even know where it came from." "We understand," Lee assured her. "That's exactly why we need your story, to set the record straight." She believed them. For 6 hours on 1st September, she explained everything: how she'd been trapped, how she refused to renounce her citizenship even when it meant starvation, how Major Cousins had recruited her to undermine propaganda through sarcasm, how she'd smuggled rice balls to American POWs during air raid drills, how every broadcast had been an act of subtle resistance that nobody would ever witness. The journalists nodded, took detailed notes, promised the article would clear her name. Then they vanished. No payment arrived. Instead, Brundage and Lee sold her story to American media outlets as a confession, framing her carefully chosen words as admissions of guilt rather than explanations of survival. Headlines screamed across Pacific editions. "Tokyo Rose speaks, I did it for money." A selective quote ripped from context where she'd explained taking the Radio Tokyo job for food rations to avoid starvation. The FBI arrested her on October 17, 1945, at 0640 hours. They transported her to Sugamo Prison, a detention facility that once held Japanese war criminals and would later house Hideki Tojo before his execution. For 1 year, Iva sat in a cell measuring 8 feet by 10 feet while investigators combed through every broadcast, every script, every witness they could locate across occupied Japan. Her pregnancy advanced through the investigation. She felt the child growing inside her while FBI agents interviewed Radio Tokyo staff, threatening them with their own treason charges unless they provided damaging testimony about Tokyo Rose's broadcasts. The FBI's final report, completed in October 1946, should have ended everything. Subjects' broadcasts were innocuous entertainment containing no actionable anti-American propaganda, no evidence of treasonous intent. Recommend case closure. The Counterintelligence Corps agreed. The Department of Justice's initial review concurred. They released her from Sugamo Prison on October 25, 1946, exactly 374 days after her arrest. She thought the nightmare was over. She was catastrophically wrong. Walter Winchell commanded an audience of 50 million Americans every Sunday evening through his NBC radio broadcast, making him more powerful than most senators and nearly as influential as the president. His staccato delivery and theatrical outrage had destroyed careers, influenced elections, and shaped public opinion through sheer repetition. In February 1948, Winchell launched a campaign that would consume the next 18 months. Tokyo Rose walks free while American boys lie in Pacific graves. Is this justice? Every Sunday, for 73 consecutive broadcasts, he hammered the same message: the traitor who mocked our boys must pay. The American Legion, 3 million veterans strong, organized letter-writing campaigns that flooded congressional offices with demands for prosecution. It was an election year. The Cold War was intensifying. Republicans accused Democrats of being soft on communists and traitors. Prosecuting Tokyo Rose became politically irresistible, a way to prove toughness without risking diplomatic incidents with Stalin. Attorney General Tom Clark, despite the FBI's findings, reopened the case in April 1948. He authorized unlimited resources, transport 19 witnesses from Japan, pay for hotel accommodations and daily stipends, provide months of witness preparation before trial. Several witnesses were broadcasters who'd actually renounced their American citizenship and produced genuine propaganda broadcasts. The government offered them immunity from prosecution
if they testified against Iva. Some were threatened, some were coached, some were paid amounts far exceeding mere travel expenses. Some lied. July 5, 1949, United States District Court, Northern California, Judge Michael Roach presiding. The trial lasted 13 weeks, one of the most expensive federal prosecutions in American history at that time, costing over $750,000, equivalent to $9.4 million in 2025 dollars. The prosecution presented 19 witnesses transported from Japan. Their testimony formed the foundation of 8 treason charges, each alleging that Iva had broadcast specific anti-American propaganda designed to demoralize troops after military defeats. The defense systematically demolished them. Witness number 1, Kenkichi Oki, former Radio Tokyo announcer, testified that Iva had gleefully announced American ship losses. Under cross-examination, defense attorney Wayne Collins revealed that Oki had renounced his American citizenship in 1943 and produced genuine propaganda broadcasts. His testimony contradicted FBI reports from 1945. When pressed, Oki admitted government lawyers had helped refresh his memory during 4 months of preparation. Witness number 4, George Mitsushio, who claimed Iva had celebrated American casualties, broke down under questioning. He admitted prosecutors had threatened him with treason charges unless he cooperated. His testimony directly contradicted statements he'd given to investigators in 1945, when he'd described Iva as reluctant and clearly uncomfortable during broadcasts.
Witness number 7, Jun Tsuyama, testified that Iva had been enthusiastic about undermining American morale. Defense produced FBI documents showing Tsuyama had been paid $2,000 in preparation expenses, nearly 10 times the standard witness fee. Under oath, she admitted prosecutors had provided her with specific phrases to use in testimony. The pattern repeated through all 19 prosecution witnesses: coached testimony, contradicted by earlier statements, motivated by threats or payments, systematically exposed as unreliable. The defense presented its own evidence. Major Calzons, flown from Australia, testified that Iva had been recruited specifically because her sarcastic delivery undermined propaganda effectiveness. Captain Wallace Ince, American POW who'd worked at Radio Tokyo, confirmed Iva had smuggled food to prisoners and deliberately sabotaged scripts. FBI agent Frederick Tillman, called by the prosecution, provided devastating testimony. "We investigated Mrs. Dakino's broadcasts extensively. We found no evidence of treasonous content. Her scripts were comedy and music." The jury deliberated for 4 days, August 29th through September 2nd, 1949. They deadlocked multiple times. The vote fluctuated, 10-2 for acquittal, then 9-3, then 8-4. Jurors later reported they believed Iva had suffered enough during her year in Sugamo prison and that the evidence didn't support conviction. But Judge Roche's instructions constrained them. They could only consider whether she'd spoken specific words into a microphone after American military losses, regardless of intent, context, or effect. The legal standard had been narrowed until truth became irrelevant. On September 29, 1949, exhausted and pressured by the judge to reach a verdict, the jury convicted Iva Toguri d'Aquino on 1 count: speaking into a microphone after the loss of an American ship. 1 count, out of 8 charges, based on testimony from witnesses who would later admit they'd been pressured to lie. The jury believed she'd already served enough time. They expected Judge Roche would sentence her to time served, 374 days in Sugamo prison, and let her go home.
They were catastrophically wrong. October 6, 1949, sentencing hearing. Judge Michael Roche looked down from the bench at Iva Toguri d'Aquino, 33 years old, exhausted, 5 months pregnant with her second child, after losing her first to stillbirth during the investigation. "You have been convicted of treason against the United States," Roche said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "The court sentences you to 10 years in federal prison and a fine of $10,000. Your United States citizenship is hereby revoked. You are declared stateless." 10 years for speaking into a microphone. Iva felt the courtroom tilt. 10 years. Her unborn child would be in elementary school before she was released. Her husband Felipe, a Portuguese citizen, had been permanently barred from entering the United States. Immigration authorities classified him as connected to an enemy alien. Their marriage was functionally over. She was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, transported to the Federal Reformatory for Women in Alderson, West Virginia, a facility 2,300 miles from her family in Chicago. 1 week later, alone in the prison hospital, she went into premature labor at 23 weeks gestation. The baby girl, unnamed because she never drew breath, was delivered stillborn on October 13, 1949. The child Iva had imagined raising in freedom, the child she'd carried through investigation and trial, the child who would have been American, was gone. Prison records show she requested to see the baby's body before burial. The request was denied per facility regulations. She was returned to her cell the following morning. For 6 years and 10 months, Iva served her sentence in Alderson. She worked in the prison laundry, pressed sheets and uniforms, kept her head down, survived. Released January 28, 1956, she returned to Chicago, where her elderly father ran a small import shop on North Clark Street. But the punishment didn't end with the sentence. She couldn't vote in the nation she'd refused to betray. She couldn't travel outside its borders. Deportation remained a constant threat, though no country would accept a stateless woman convicted of treason. She worked long hours stocking shelves, managing inventory, aging invisibly in the shadows of a country that had decided she was guilty before any evidence existed. The legend of Tokyo Rose demanded a sacrifice. Iva Toguri d'Aquino had paid the price. For 21 years after her release, Iva lived as a ghost in her own country. Customers who recognized her name would sometimes spit insults or walk out without purchasing anything. Hate mail arrived sporadically at her father's shop, anonymous letters calling her traitor, Jap spy, enemy. She never responded, never defended herself publicly, just worked, survived, endured. Her father died in 1972, leaving her alone in the tiny apartment above the shop. No husband, Felipe had remained in Japan until his death in 1976, their marriage dissolved by distance and bureaucracy. No children, both lost, one to stillbirth, one to premature labor. No country, legally stateless despite being born on American soil. But in 1974, something shifted in the machinery of history. 2 investigative journalists, Ron Yates and Mark Gain, unconnected to the original case, began excavating archives that had been sealed for decades. What they discovered shattered the foundation of Iva's conviction. Internal FBI memos dated August 1946. Coached testimony extensively. Reliability questionable. Recommend case closure. Department of Justice Internal Communications from 1948. Evidence insufficient for conviction under normal circumstances. Political pressure from the White House and American Legion forcing prosecution. Witness statements taken in 1975, after the statute of limitations had expired. George Mitsushio admitted prosecutors had helped him remember events that never occurred. Jun Suyama confessed she'd been paid $2,000 and coached for 4 months before trial. Kenkichi Oki revealed FBI agents had threatened him with deportation unless he provided damaging testimony. The case had been built on perjury from the beginning, coerced testimony, manufactured evidence, and political pressure that overwhelmed justice. CBS's 60 Minutes aired the findings on February 6, 1976. Mike Wallace interviewed Iva in her Chicago apartment, the camera capturing a woman aged beyond her 60 years, gray-haired and weary, speaking quietly about survival and sacrifice.
"I never called myself Tokyo Rose," she told Wallace, her voice still carrying that distinctive California rasp. "That was something soldiers invented. I was just trying to stay alive." Public opinion shifted like a dam breaking. Veterans groups who'd once demanded her prosecution now questioned the conviction. The Japanese American Citizens League launched a campaign for presidential pardon. Legal scholars called it one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in American legal history. President Gerald Ford, in his final days in office, reviewed the petition. On January 19, 1977, his last full day as president, he granted Iva Toguri d'Aquino a full presidential pardon. She was 60 years old. More than 3 decades had passed since that fragmentary transmission from Hiroshima. More than half her life had been spent marked as a traitor. When reporters asked for her reaction to the pardon, Iva spoke carefully, measuring each word with the precision of someone who'd learned that words could destroy you. "It is hard to believe, but I have always maintained my innocence. This pardon is a measure of vindication. Not full vindication, a measure. Because 32 years couldn't be returned. A stillborn child couldn't be brought back. A marriage couldn't be restored. The decades of exile, shame, and statelessness couldn't be erased with a presidential signature. Her American citizenship was restored, but the woman who received it was not the same woman who'd lost it. She lived another 29 years after the pardon, working quietly in her Chicago apartment, rarely granting interviews, avoiding attention. When the University of Southern California's journalism school presented her with an award recognizing the injustice of her case, she accepted it with dignity but little triumph. "I don't want to be remembered as Tokyo Rose," she told the assembled journalists and students. "I want to be remembered as an American who never stopped being American, even when her country stopped believing her." On September 26, 2006, Iva Toguri d'Aquino died in Chicago at age 90, an American citizen, officially pardoned, legally vindicated, but never fully restored. The final truth, the truth that defined everything, crystallized in that moment on August 6, 1945, when Iva Toguri understood what atomic weapons meant for the world and for her own survival. She believed, like every Japanese citizen and propaganda broadcaster, that America would eventually exhaust itself, that distance and determination would force negotiation, that the war would end through mutual exhaustion rather than absolute victory. Hiroshima destroyed that illusion in 0.6 seconds, the time it took for little boy's uranium-235 core to achieve supercritical mass and release energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. America hadn't been losing. America had been holding back. The nation that could build atomic weapons could dictate any terms it wanted. And victorious nations always demanded someone pay for their suffering, someone to embody the betrayal and rage of 3 years of Pacific hell.
Tokyo Rose, the mythical seductress who never existed, became that payment. Dozens of women had broadcast from Japanese-controlled territories. Ruth Hayakawa, June Suyama, Myrtle Lipton, all produced English-language radio shows. Soldiers scattered across Pacific Islands, listening through static in darkness, had merged them into a single legendary villain because humans need evil to have a face and a name. But only Iva had refused to renounce her citizenship. Only Iva had maintained her American identity through starvation and threats. Only Iva had that unmistakable California voice, raspy, masculine, impossible to mistake for anyone else. So she became Tokyo Rose in retrospect, convicted of a legend she never claimed, sentenced for broadcasts that contained no treason, sacrificed to satisfy a nation's need for vengeance. The atomic bomb didn't just end World War II. It transformed warfare itself, made conventional military thinking obsolete, introduced weapons that could end civilization, created a world where the margin between conflict and extinction became measured in minutes rather than years. And it sealed Iva Toguri's fate as surely as it vaporized Hiroshima's downtown. Because in the new world that August 6, 1945 created, there was no room for nuance, for survival, for impossible choices made under enemy occupation. There was only victory and defeat, patriot and traitor, legend and truth. The legend always wins. August 6, 1945. Radio Tokyo Broadcasting Studio. 14:45 hours. A single decoded transmission lying on the engineering desk. Entire city destroyed by single bomb. Reconnaissance reports describing 3 B-29s and a mushroom cloud rising 40,000 feet into the sky, glowing purple and orange with colors that seemed alive. The microphone light glowing red in the humidity and dust of a building that had survived firebombing but would not survive history's judgment. Iva Toguri, 29 years old, exhausted, 2 months pregnant, and trapped between two nations at war, one of which would win and come looking for someone to pay, looking at that light and understanding what it meant. She whispered 5 words. Not into the microphone, not to the soldiers listening across the Pacific, but to herself, a recognition that changed everything. America isn't surrendering. And in that moment, she knew her life had stopped being her own. It had become property of a legend, fuel for a myth, payment for a war that atomic weapons had rendered so overwhelming that someone, somewhere, had to embody the cost. She was the only American voice the enemy had put on the air. That was enough to destroy her. Not because she was guilty of treason. Every investigation proved she wasn't. Not because her broadcasts demoralized troops. Soldiers later testified they'd laughed at her jokes. Not because she betrayed her country. She'd starved rather than renounce her citizenship. But because Tokyo Rose needed to be real. And Iva Toguri was the only American woman close enough to that fantasy that a victorious nation could transform legend into flesh, myth into conviction, rage into a 10-year sentence that cost her everything she had fought to preserve. The moment she realized America wasn't surrendering was the moment her life stopped being her own and started belonging to history's need for villains more convenient than truth. That microphone light glowing red, that fragmentary transmission from Hiroshima, That recognition that atomic weapons had changed not just warfare, but the very nature of justice, evidence, and truth. One woman, one legend, one weapon that made everything before it obsolete, including the idea that innocence mattered more than the stories nations tell themselves about their enemies. Tokyo Rose never existed, but she destroyed Iva Toguri anyway.